In the modern world, one of the most controversial parts of the New Testament relate to Christian teachings about the role of wives. The apostles seem to teach that wives were meant to be obedient to their husbands. And in the past century of the modern feminist movement, this idea, along with others, has obviously fallen greatly out of fashion. To the best of my knowledge, the modern magisterium since the Second Vatican Council has also made no attempt to teach Catholic women that they should obey their husbands. There are not many clergy or bishops teaching this to their faithful, and generally, a large number of modern Catholics, at least in the developed world, think that this traditional idea about the role of women doesn't belong to the gospel. In this video, I'm going to try to address this topic and explain what I think is the correct teaching on the subject. To begin with, let us first look at the relevant scripture passages, beginning with probably the most famous one. Genesis 3 verse 16, to the woman he said, "I will intensify the pangs of your childbearing. In pain shall you bring forth children. Yet your urge shall be for your husband, and he shall be your master." In the story of Genesis, God punishes Eve by making her husband into her master. This seems to indicate that the domination of men over women is something that came from sin, and it wasn't part of the original plan that God had for the two sexes. Earlier, when God created Eve, he made her to be a helper fit for Adam, but didn't say anything about Adam being her master. It was only once sin and death came into existence that the domination of human beings over one another then entered into the world as well. Then, let us look next at the New Testament passages where the apostles taught that wives should obey their husbands. 1 Corinthians 11 verse 3, "But I want you to know that Christ is the head of every man, and a husband the head of his wife, and God the head of Christ." Ephesians 5 verses 21 to 33, "Be subordinate to one another out of reverence for Christ." Wives should be subordinate to their husbands as to the Lord. For the husband is head of his wife, just as Christ is head of the church, he himself the Savior of the body. As the church is subordinate to Christ, so wives should be subordinate to their husbands in everything. Husbands, love your wives, even as Christ loved the church and handed himself over for her to sanctify her, cleansing her by the bath of water with the word, that he might present to himself the church in splendor, without spot or wrinkle or any such thing, that she might be holy and without blemish. So also husbands should love their wives as their own bodies. He who loves his wife loves himself. For no one hates his own flesh, but rather nourishes and cherishes it, even as Christ does the church, because we are members of his body. For this reason a man shall leave his father and his mother and be joined to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. This is a great mystery, but I speak in reference to Christ and the church. In any case, each one of you should love his wife as himself, and the wife should respect her husband. Colossians 3 verses 18 to 19, "Wives, be subordinate to your husbands, as is proper in the Lord. Husbands, love your wives, and avoid any bitterness toward them." 1 Timothy 2 verses 11 to 15. A woman must receive instruction silently and under complete control. I do not permit a woman to teach or to have authority over a man. She must be quiet. For Adam was formed first, then Eve. Further, Adam was not deceived, but the woman was deceived and transgressed. But she will be saved through motherhood, provided women persevere in faith and love and holiness with self-control. Titus 2 verses 3 to 5 similarly. Older women should be reverent in their behavior, not slanderers, not addicted to drink, teaching what is good, so that they may train younger women to love their husbands and children, to be self-controlled, chaste, good homemakers, under the control of their husbands, so that the word of God may not be discredited. 1 Peter 3 verses 1 to 7 likewise. You wives should be subordinate to your husbands, so that, even if some disobey the word, they may be won over without a word by their wives' conduct when they observe your reverent and chaste behavior. Your adornment should not be an external one, braiding the hair, wearing gold jewelry, or dressing in fine clothes, but rather the hidden character of the heart, expressed in the imperishable beauty of a gentle and calm disposition, which is precious in the sight of God. For this is also how the holy women who hoped in God once used to adorn themselves and were subordinate to their husbands. Thus Sarah obeyed Abraham, calling him Lord. You are her children when you do what is good and fear no intimidation. Likewise, you husbands should live with your wives in understanding, showing honor to the weaker female sex, since we are joint heirs of the gift of life, so that your prayers may not be hindered. Peter and Paul, or at least whoever wrote these letters, clearly seem to teach that wives are supposed to be subordinate to their husbands. They also teach for slaves to obey masters, for children to obey parents, or for Christians to obey the lawful authorities. Despite the fact that you can find many modern Catholics that want to either ignore or reinterpret what this is saying, it is quite difficult to ignore the fact that the New Testament does seem quite clear on this point, that wives are supposed to be obedient to their husbands. To this we could add some of the writings of the early church fathers to show that these passages were historically understood in this way too. John Chrysostom, doctor of the church and bishop of Constantinople, preached this as part of his homilies on Ephesians. For if he who resists these external authorities, those of governments, withstand the ordinance of God, much more does she who submits not herself to her husband. Such was God's will from the beginning. The doctor of the church claims that just as how, when subjects don't obey earthly rulers, they're going against the authority of God, that when wives don't obey their husbands, they're even more greatly going against the authority of God. It is a greater disobedience in his teaching, because governments have not existed forever, but marriage was instituted by God before history began. Make a note here about this. Chrysostom claims that the submission of wife to husband was God's will from the beginning. This would seem to suggest that he didn't believe this was something that came about because of sin, but rather he thought that it was part of the original creation for the wife to be submissive to the husband. We'll get back to this point later. St. Augustine, another doctor of the church and bishop of Hippo, said this in one of his early writings of the morals of the Catholic Church. Your training and teaching are childlike for children, forcible for youths, peaceful for the aged, taking into account the age of the mind as well as of the body. Thou subjectest women to their husbands in chaste and faithful obedience, not to gratify passion, but for the propagation of offspring and for domestic society. You give to men authority over their wives, not to mock the weaker sex, but in the laws of unfeigned love. Now, although to the best of my knowledge, the modern magisterium doesn't seem to teach the obedience of wives to husbands in any clear way, the preconciliar magisterium did. Leo XIII, in his 1880 encyclical on Christian marriage, Arcanum, wrote the following about the topic of the obedience of wives to husbands. Secondly, the mutual duties of husband and wife have been defined, and their several rights accurately established. They are bound, namely, to have such feelings for one another as to cherish always very great mutual love, to be ever faithful to their marriage vow, and to give one another an unfailing and unselfish help. The husband is the chief of the family and the head of the wife. The woman, because she is flesh of his flesh and bone of his bone, must be subject to her husband and obey him, not, indeed, as a servant, but as a companion, so that her obedience shall be wanting in neither honor nor dignity. Since the husband represents Christ, and since the wife represents the church, let there always be, both in him who commands and in her who obeys, a heaven-born love guiding both in their respective duties. For the husband is the head of the wife, as Christ is the head of the church. Therefore, as the church is subject to Christ, so also let wives be to their husbands in all things. In 1930, Pius XI wrote another encyclical about Christian marriage on the 50-year anniversary of Arcanum. This encyclical was called Casti Connubii, and it included the following teaching. Domestic society being confirmed, therefore, by this bond of love, there should flourish in it that order of love, as St. Augustine calls it. This order includes both the primacy of the husband with regard to the wife and children, the ready subjection of the wife, and her willing obedience, which the apostle commends in these words. Let women be subject to their husbands as to the Lord, because the husband is the head of the wife, and Christ is the head of the church. This subjection, however, does not deny or take away the liberty which fully belongs to the woman, both in view of her dignity as a human person and in view of her most noble office as wife and mother and companion. Nor does it bid her obey her husband's every request if not in harmony with right reason or with the dignity due to wife. Nor, in fine, does it imply that the wife should be put on a level with those persons who in law are called minors, to whom it is not customary to allow free exercise of their rights on account of their lack of mature judgment or of their ignorance of human affairs. But it forbids that exaggerated liberty which cares not for the good of the family. It forbids that in this body which is the family, the heart be separated from the head to the great detriment of the whole body and the proximate danger of ruin. For if the man is the head, the woman is the heart, and as he occupies the chief place in ruling, so she may and ought to claim for herself the chief place in love. Again, this subjection of wife to husband in its degree and manner may vary according to the different conditions of persons, place, and time. In fact, if the husband neglect his duty, it falls to the wife to take his place in directing the family. But the structure of the family and its fundamental law, established and confirmed by God, must always and everywhere be maintained intact. There's a lot to unpack in these teachings, and you can see from it that the explanation is more nuanced and complex than simple obedience. Pius XI said that the woman can take the role of the head of the family if the husband is neglecting his duty, and that the woman does not need to obey the husband's every request when those requests are against reason or dignity. But to put it simply, the Pope does in fact recognize that the man is the head and the wife is supposed to obey him. The man is the head and the woman is the heart, according to this teaching. One has a chief place in ruling, and the other has a chief place in love. But although this is clearly magisterial teaching, the modern post-conciliar church greatly shies away from teaching this. As I said earlier, to the best of my knowledge, there are no clear statements from the modern magisterium that tell Catholic women that they have a moral obligation to obey their husbands. There are clergy out there who are teaching it, but it doesn't seem to be a common thing being taught in the modern church. The Catechism, for example, makes no mention of it. But the fact that the modern magisterium is silent about it doesn't mean that it stops being part of the church's teaching. If something truly belonged to the teaching of the church at any time, then this thing also belongs to the teaching of the church for all times, even if people in authority neglect to teach it. If the apostles, church fathers, and past popes truly taught that wives must obey their husbands, or else they commit sin, then this still remains true today. The fact that something is now scandalous doesn't mean that the teaching became false. It rather only means that our own age has drifted away from the truth, if this teaching is indeed the moral truth. In a mysterious way, I feel like it is almost a snapshot or a figure of what the modern world has become. The woman represents the church and the man represents Christ. And in the past, there was perhaps little ambiguity within the church about the idea that Catholics needed to obey the church teachings. Although in the modern world, a lot of people challenge or reject church teachings about all sorts of things, which is perhaps like a wife thinking she no longer has to obey her husband. Whereas in the society, many wives have rejected the idea that they are morally obligated to obey their husbands. The lack of obedience of wives towards husbands is like the lack of obedience of humanity to God's authority. In a mysterious way, I feel like what has changed with the physical marriage in the modern day is like a symbol representing what has happened at the same time with the spiritual marriage. But while it would clearly seem to be the case that the gospel teaches that wives should obey their husbands, even if the modern church is very neglectful in teaching this, there's a piece of modern magisterial teaching that I think needs to be referenced here to get a more complete picture of what this means. In John Paul II's 1988 apostolic letter on the dignity of women, he talked about how the wound of original sin had turned the free gift of the woman's love into a kind of object of male domination. The following is a small portion from what he wrote about this. The inheritance of sin suggested by the words of the Bible, "Your desire shall be for your husband, and he shall rule over you," can be conquered only by following this path. The overcoming of this evil inheritance is, generation after generation, the task of every human being, whether woman or man. For whenever man is responsible for offending a woman's personal dignity and vocation, he acts contrary to his own personal dignity and his own vocation. John Paul II says that sin is what caused the man to dominate the woman, and that every human, whether male or female, in every generation, must work to overcome this inheritance. On the surface, it would seem like John Paul II is saying that the church should work to put an end to patriarchy and the control of men by women, which then would seem to be in contradiction with all those other things I quoted earlier. But it doesn't have to be interpreted as a contradiction. Chrysostom taught that it was God's will from the beginning for the wife to obey the husband, which means that this wasn't something that came from sin. I think there's a difference between saying that a wife is obedient to her husband and saying that a husband dominates the wife. In John Paul's teaching, the woman's love for the man was meant to be a free gift, not something that was compelled. Indeed, love which is compelled is not really love at all. Love is either freely given or it is not really love at all. It could be true that when God created Eve before the fall, God intended for Eve to be obedient to Adam, but this gift of her obedience would have been something she gave by her own choice, and not because Adam forced her to obey. But after they sinned, husbands then dominated their wives and forced them into submission, such that they obeyed, not as a free gift, but rather as something they did to avoid being punished or abandoned. If we take my interpretation here, then I think we can say that John Paul II's letter was not saying that Christians should be trying to abolish the patriarchy, but rather they should be removing all elements of compulsion within it. Husbands should not force their wives into submission, but wives should be submissive to their husbands. There are parts of the Bible that talk about the need for fathers to discipline their children. There is nowhere in the Bible that promotes the idea that husbands should discipline their wives. Husbands should submit themselves to God and love their wives. If the wife doesn't obey, then that is the wife's decision to go against God's will, and the husband should not compel her otherwise. But wives, if they wish to be good disciples of Christ, should voluntarily submit themselves and obey their husbands without being compelled. This compulsion is the domination that every generation of men and women should be fighting against. But the relationship of obedience, where the heart obeys the head, is not something that we should be fighting against or seeking to abolish. Instead, the church should still be teaching this now and telling Catholic women that they still need to obey their husbands, regardless of how our current culture teaches otherwise.